All right, again, my name is Chuck Pyle, and I'm a wildlife biologist with the Partners for Wish Wildlife Program. We went through that program talk at the beginning of the grazing school, and it's a really good opportunity. We kind of take into account, maybe we kind of, even as a manager or operator of some land, maybe try to figure out who your partners are. And even from a wildlife end of things, it wasn't that long ago that we didn't understand even who our partners were. Maybe Tim alluded to it on Monday that most of the land is in private ownership, and if there's different organizations that want to work on things or keep a landscape in a certain direction, we have to work together. So today I'm going to try to incorporate and bring how biodiversity and that productivity out there, especially on native rangeland, but it just in all in total landscape, how important that is, and how it reflects on management on your actual individual ranch, and pretty much all the way across the landscape, how it relates to that whole total ecosystem approach. So we'll go back to school a little bit this morning. Might be kind of hard on our heads. Take into account what are ecosystems. We talked a little bit about yesterday, especially in our monitoring. I think, and a lot of you guys are already aware of the importance of them plant communities, and especially that diversity in them plant communities that you're out there grazing on or managing, the different types of management that you can do, and the benefits that you can be rewarded with out of that. Also, the main portion of this presentation I'm going to give you is what about wildlife? Where do they fit into that puzzle of managing your land? Are they actually an indicator of how successful you are doing out there, or how healthy your range management is? And then also kind of keep you up to speed a little bit on how livestock and wildlife correlate. And then the main thing of all things is just to make you sustainable out there on the landscape. Because if you're not sustainable, things will change, and we got to work together on this. So let's go into this a little bit. What are ecosystems? This could be all the way back for 6th grade, and then they try to recharge you back when you go to college. If anybody's taking ecology class at SDSU. But in a whole ecosystem, it's pretty. You think of things, it's the non-living and the living things that all factor in to a complex situation, and it's how these organisms and the environment and that whole community relate to each other. And that's how you have to take your approach, even on your place, is when you change something within that environment in that community, then you have to replace it with something else, because you're changing that whole entire ecosystem. Here's a small portion of and you think it's complex with all them arrows and stuff. That's just actually a grazing mammal up there. It's kind of hard to see in the center, and it's just a small portion of a complex ecosystem. But look at the things that are involved. Especially, you have your baseline stuff, that community and the habitat. It's kind of holds everything together. But it's kind of like a food chain or a food pyramid, where anywhere from we have the nutrients and the decomposers, invertebrates, microorganisms, breaking down that vegetation, regenerating and providing good nutrients to the soil. Soil and provides uptake into the vegetation, and then it goes up into the grazing animal. There's a little bit of competition between the grazing animal with parasites, predators. It's just that whole chain that's in that ecosystem, and that's just a small breakdown of how complex some of these systems are and how they all relate to each other. Basic organism needs. It's just like any one of us. We need oxygen, energy, and water out there. And that all includes into that habitat that we live, or we actually live in, or what we actually need. So a couple different processes that help us manage our ecosystems. We've gone through most of these actually. You might not even think about it, but overall, with all the presentations that we've had throughout this grazing school, we've actually gone through a lot of these processes. And actually, even when you're actually on the ground, setting up your managed grazing cycle with your experiment out in the field, and a lot of our monitoring exercises all go through these processes and how important they are, and paying attention. And that energy flow, it's pretty much just kind of like a big food pyramid here. And the thing that we don't realize is how much is actually going on below the ground. And Jeff and Stan pointed out on some of that soil stuff yesterday how important that stuff that we don't see, how important that is on our place, and you need to take an effect when you're out there doing your management. And trying to use as much of that energy and not let that stuff get away. The mineral cycle. We talked about keeping those nutrients, keeping that water, protecting our runoff. We want that any of that dung to go back into the soil. We want our decomposers, our invertebrates, our microorganisms to break down that old dead vegetation out there. If we don't have something to break it down, that doesn't get back into our soil system, and our plants end up getting degraded. Same way, if something doesn't get managed or our grasses don't get used, our vegetation degrades over time. So we got to work and do some types of management to help recycle, and it really comes back to that soil surface management. That's some of the key player in this mineral cycle. Also in the water cycle, the soil surface is so important. We went through that with the rainfall simulator. Doesn't show it any better than that rainfall simulator yesterday, and how important that is to keep that soil or that water going back into your ground, recharge that groundwater, recharge your vegetation, helps promote growth, and just keeps that whole cycle going along. And even we think about succession, if we can use our management techniques to actually mimic or kind of control that succession. If we want certain vegetations, plant in there, different plant species, and we can really keep that set up and can kind of control that process. But it all comes back to that soil surface management and how we take care of that area and use what we have there. So all in all, you guys are putting yourself in a pretty hard shoe if you're using grasslands or depending on them, because that prairie ecosystem, when you take a look at them, it's all living things, all the plants and animals working together, but then it's all the non-living things that work together as well. You know, the effects of drought, the effects of high water times, and the classification of your soils, and then also, you know, fire and a lot of the nutrients in there. They're all part of it. The unique thing that is maybe you guys, even as ranchers on the landscape where you're trying to use and manage native rangeland, you guys are almost an endangered species out there, so to speak. You look across the United States, we've got 3% of the native prairie that's remaining out there. And, you know, that's one thing that Tim alluded to the other day as well. When you're looking for partnerships, this is one of the key reasons that you see so many different nonprofit and agency programs set up around grasslands, because we have lost a lot of our grasslands already. And now we're trying to do the best that we can do with what we have remaining. Just to kind of go into that grassland loss thing a little bit, you can kind of see across those 5 states or states that are in the prairie pothole region. And a lot of our research was based off that. When you think about wildlife, a lot of research was always conducted with waterfowl. And waterfowl, you know, we can see that we lost a lot of our grasslands in Minnesota and Iowa, and the same way with our wetlands in that country as well. And you can see, probably because that's a better soil type. You know, it's very fertile. They can do, you know, grow a lot of great things over there. But then when we move west, you can see that things have changed over time, and we keep pushing and pushing, and we keep losing a lot more of our grasslands across there. Now that it's even, you know, not just the tallgrass prairie, but even in the mixed grass prairie, and even pushing out into that short grass prairie where we're changing that landscape level. Just a couple of numbers just to throw out there, just to think about. Think even in a short period of time in eastern South Dakota, if we're losing 2.2% was converted in that time frame. Just think if you extrapolate that out, how much is actually going to be left after a while? Where's that plant diversity going to be out there? We're going to end up having pretty much a monoculture landscape, and then how are you going to manage your property in a monoculture landscape? Because diversification, even on a ranch, is important because you got to have, even like this dry time, you're going to have production or grass or food sources readily available at different times of the year, and you're going to have to set that up. How does that loss of grassland trend to our grassland bird populations? Well, across the United States, we've been seeing this for quite some time. It's easy to see. Birds that are needing or associated with grassland have been declining. And then if you really look, in South Dakota, we've actually had, probably the most success of controlling our grassland and having a lot of it available yet. Just over this short time, 1980 to 2007, look at the change that we've had here, especially like the grasshopper sparrow and the chestnut collared longspur. Their populations that are really focused on large tracts of grasslands have really taken a dive. And that's just an indicator of what's going on in that landscape. I mean, this is a easy chart to see that. Air, stats. How much air is in that number? Because it comes off a model. So even the wildlife folks are taking into account that, hey, we need to find some different partners. I kind of alluded to that at the beginning, that if we don't work together with everybody, there's a good chance that we'll end up having a bigger list of endangered species out there. And I'm not sure if we want to do that. There's going to be changes over time anyway, but if there's a way that we can kind of control some of our grassland loss, I think it'll be a win-win situation for everybody. Grassland loss and fragmentation. What ends up going out there and how it relates to wildlife. Increases in monocultures, especially invasive species, and then the decrease in that plant community. That's one attribute to the loss of different grassland-dependent birds out there. That increased edge habitat. Some species of grassland-dependent birds, they want large tracts of grasslands. That's what they're associated with. Their nesting success is higher. The other thing is, we talk about the stuff that's in the ground. Things that we don't actually consider wildlife is them invertebrates. When we decrease that plant diversity out there in the landscape, we're losing our food source. And then, how is that on your native rangeland health? When we actually diversify or change that habitat and increase our monocultures, is it really as healthy as it was with a diverse plant community? Over time, that fragmentation process, you can look, this is actually up in Prairie, Canada, and in the Prairie Pyle region, pretty heavy wetlands up in that country. But look at how things have changed over time and how the landscape is fragmented. And when you really relate it back to wildlife, that increase in more edge effect, it actually lowers your nesting success, and it just comes in full bloom there. And if we look at the waterfowl nesting success, that's where a lot of these tables will show. It all depends on that grassland patch size. The larger that patch size, the better chance or probability that grassland bird is going to raise its young and have a suitable nest and brood rearing process. And one of the other things that come in with the edge effect and the transitions between breaking up that cropland is a common indicator that happens in wildlife is nest parasitism. And within that, there's actually, let's say if you end up bringing a whole bunch of trees into an area or just breaking the pasture up even more, different species of birds actually come in to, let's say, this upland sandpiper, or everybody knows what western meadowlark is. You see them on the fence posts a lot. These guys, this western meadowlark, his eggs down in here, and what ends up happening, or the brown-headed cowbird, she'll come in there. It's an exotic. It's kind of like brome grass from a grass standpoint. They actually come in there and lay an egg within that same nest of meadowlark, and that little guy, the meadowlark, will actually raise that bird's young. And that little one will actually outcompete the western meadowlark's chicks, and maybe even kick some of the eggs out of they usually nest maybe a day or two ahead of the other ones. And that meadowlark will actually feed that brown-headed cowbird and actually raise its young. And that's what parasitism is. And that happens the more edge effect or the different changes that we have across these grasslands, bringing trees in or just changing that structure out there that actually wasn't native or what certain grassland-dependent birds are associated with, really changes their, it's kind of just like that nesting success with regards to predation of other mammals feeding on grassland birds. And this is just to show that patch size mimics what that parasitism is with this grassland, or the grasshopper and the savanna sparrow. How that changes, the bigger the grass tract is, the lower chance of that parasitism is going to happen. So we get it through that wildlife. Probably bored you a little bit about how it works with you and how on your ranch as well. What about the grazing and management effects on the plant species? There's a lot of research out there, and we kind of went through it a little bit yesterday on our monitoring exercise on the importance of what you guys can do on your place to control that plant diversity out on your landscape. If you want to just not do anything and just leave it alone, more than likely a couple species are going to end up taking over, and it will not be as plant diversified anymore. So there's a research project down in Kansas as an example of this. They broke it down into 13 pastures, 32 acres in size, and prescribed burning is always a big thing in that Flint Hills region. And they used one pasture as kind of an unbiased paddock, and then 9 of the pastures were designed for that late season rest rotation. They're trying to incorporate keeping enough vegetation there so that they can conduct their burning in the spring of next year. And 3 pastures were designed for season-long grazing. So you can see that it was 50% utilization rate on that stock density, stocking density. Graze the pastures showed any type of management is really what it comes down to. You're going to have especially on a native rangeland site, you're going to have diverse plant species community out there compared to something that's just left alone. We've seen that even in the wildlife field that, hey, you just can't leave this stuff idle. If you leave it idle, it actually degrades and you don't have the wildlife presence in there as you would with something that's being managed. They found there was no differences between the 2 grazing systems, but just showing that the plant species richness in those areas were the same as long as you were doing some type of management out there. Now, the unique thing that ended up coming through on this whole thing is that stock density actually played the major role into having the most plant species diversity on those sites. As you can see, where they had a little bit higher stock density, you can see the species richness of the plant community out there was, 5% higher than actually what some of these other areas were. Not a lot, when it comes down to statistics on the differences, but there was some noticeable changes on that composition of tall grass prairie out there. Okay, so we know that within your management styles, you can actually diversify that wildlife or the grassland plant community out there. Well, what about bugs? Can these bugs or invertebrates, are they actually wildlife? Are they actually ideas that we need to incorporate into our management concerns? Are they important to us? And how do they relate? And, what do they do? Well, we know, especially these pollinators out there, they are a very crucial insect that we rely on, especially in any plant community. And then what about the decomposers as well? Well, let's see, we might even take this a little bit farther in our thoughts. Can these bugs be indicators of range health? And this actually was a research project actually completed down in 1979, and Nagel did, down in Nebraska, I believe. And they were trying to determine that if a diverse plant community of native rangeland, if those systems had more invertebrates compared to something that was maybe more of a monoculture or didn't have much management in terms of grassland management taking place out there. There was one site that wasn't grazed during the study, kind of has that same unbiased change, kind of compared to something that was idle. The unique thing was the yearly precipitation in those range sites had the most, Mother Nature had the most to do with the difference on some of those species of insects that were out there. And then really what it came back down to is the biomass and the plant species density, and then that vertical stratification that we talked about yesterday, that we were monitoring with regards to the wildlife or that vegetation structure. That and that range condition were the most important plant factors for predicting what invertebrates were out there. And it kind of goes hand in hand. The more the more diverse that our plant community is, the more we'll have a lot diversified in different species of insects out there as well, which is true. You think of that nice prairie ecosystem, we're going to have a flux of invertebrates and microorganisms out there doing their thing in the ground that we don't see. How do we take this another step further? How do livestock and wildlife interact, and what are the benefits? Can you actually manage your livestock and be sustainable, plus have a benefit to wildlife out there, and do they work together? Salo did a research project up in North Dakota in 2004 looking at this exact idea and trying to see if you can actually be sustainable and do good things out there on the ground and work within the management perspective of grassland managers. So 65%, what are we looking here? Stocking rate, they did a 65%, 50%, 35%, and 20% of the forage produced that they were trying to leave remaining. That's what was being left. When we look at performance, that's usually what all in all, they actually going back to the livestock, the end product that's coming out there, your harvesting machine. You show with these different breakdowns of stocking rates, and this is where their stocking rates come into play on the ones that they set up here, and these were with yearlings. I think this would have been back at that 20% and 65. All right. So the light stocking rate where they were leaving 65% was left, and where the extreme there was about 20% of the residual was left. So you can look at even at the average daily gains, how they kind of changed across the board up here. But then look at, I guess the real importance where it comes down to how many pounds per acre, where it focused in on these two moderate and heavy areas, where they were probably, somewhere in between, probably the best bang for the buck from the livestock guy. These visual obstruction readings that we actually did a little bit yesterday, look at the difference that the stocking rates had across the board on that. Anywhere from 19, 18 inches in that light to moderate, all the way to 9 to 3 inches in the extreme. So, we're actually out there doing some management on the ground. We're going to have a diversity of that vegetation structure out there across the ground. Well, how do these birds respond? We can see where we're getting, a pound and 3/4 to almost 2 pounds of gain on some of those guys. That should be able to be sustainable out there. Well, how does it relate to wildlife? Well, it's really interesting. We just talked about the other day, and if we're in here going to a restaurant to eat and eating that diversity of food, somebody might have spaghetti, somebody might want pizza, somebody might want something totally separate. Same way with the wildlife community and the birds that are dependent on these grasslands. You can see where the higher numbers is actually where these birds were associated most with. Where like this clay-colored sparrow and the grasshopper, they liked an area that didn't have as much management left. That BOR reading was a lot higher compared to that horned lark and that upland sandpiper. They liked this area that was really beat down. There wasn't as much left. That visual obstruction reading was a lot lower. And that's it. Really, that grazing intensity is what we're kind of coming back to on these different species. And the main thing is taken in account here is that just that whole suite of grassland ruminant birds, they all relate to different vegetation structure heights. And that diversity out there in the landscape is most important. This is where it comes back to this big slide here. Grazing pressure. Anywhere from excessive to light to none. There's just a mirage of different grassland-dependent bird species that relate to that. And that's why it's important to have that diversity across that landscape. Even as a bigger landscape picture, we look at this. You think of, you can even go a little bit farther than this. You think of mixed grass prairie to tall grass prairie. Remember we were looking at that, those VOR readings were giving us that vertical structure out there, that difference in plant communities. And even within those two ecoregions of that tall grass prairie and the mixed grass prairie, we're going to have different species that relate differently to those sites, where it all is based off that structure, how tall that plant is. Because some of our plants aren't as tall, even when we go East River to West River, where like this grasshopper sparrow, he likes light to moderate grazing pressure in the East River, where it needs to be light West River, just because of the change in the precipitation, the plant dynamics out there. All in all, when we're trying to figure out how to balance our place and do the best management we can, it all comes back to that heterogeneity. And this is kind of a really broad kind of picture, but I'll give you a couple examples of what this would be. I'd say this heterogeneity effect would be actually, you could actually take a look at a landscape right here that we're suited around right now. We have a lot of grassland still around the Chamberlain area, but then also we have some crop. There's some diversity out there. That vegetation structure is diverse. But then let's say what would be an example of this homogeneous site. I would say my hometown back in northwest Iowa would be very homogeneous. There's not much pasture left. There's just that plant diversity isn't there. It's corn or it's beans. There's no difference. So all in all in that, when we talked about having that diversity yesterday and today, that we showed you through some of these studies, that plant diversity, that vegetation structure diversity out there is going to have the most effect on your wildlife species. You're going to have not as many species in a homogeneous area just because that diversity isn't there. You might have 5 or 6 different species of wildlife compared to an area here or even in a real nice prairie ecosystem where that diverse plant community is. We're going to have a lot of different species of wildlife, and our richness is going to be very high. So in a sustainable ecosystem, you can be sustainable and managing your rangeland the best that you can, and manage where it comes back into is changing that season of use. That's probably one of the biggest things, especially on your grassland management, and how it actually relates to wildlife. If you continue to change that seasonal use, you're changing your plant community from year after year. And if you do that, that actually, comes back to the ecosystem approach. You're keeping that diversity across there. Species richness and diversity should be a goal when you're being sustainable. And what ends up happening, if you need some cropland, you need some hayland, pick the best soil type for that. Pick the stuff that's best suitable for that, not the worst stuff. Pick some of the best stuff. And when you actually convert cropland or something that's been converted already back to native grasses, or you're trying to bring back that ecosystem, the more plant seeds, and you can even actually go out there and harvest some of your own native seeds off your own place, the more of that type of seed that you can get back into those areas that you're trying to plant and try to mimic what was actually there originally, that's what will actually make that planting the most sustainable. And that's just one thing to take into account there. So just in summary, just kind of clean things up here. That proper grazing management and what you do as a manager out there on the landscape, that's where you have the biggest chance to increase plant diversity and control it in what direction you want to see it go and meet your goals. That grassland vegetation heterogeneity supports a large number of plant, that just increases your plant community, and it also diversifies the animal species that it will contain, mainly because of that structural complexity out there. We talked a little bit about wildlife. That size of that pasture is really important from a wildlife standpoint, and presence of trees and that surrounding habitat. That all affects how wildlife correlate in that environment. And in summary, if you manage that vegetation and manage it in a heterogeneity way, you're going to continue to have that plant diversification, which will help you be sustainable, with regards to your livestock and different times of drought or high water time or high precipitation times. It'll be balanced, and you're going to continue to have that biodiversity out there across the land. That stock density, where it comes back, that stock density, you have a chance, and probably use that the most to manage some of these plant communities, and it will reflect on the grassland-dependent bird species out there as well. And it'll actually, I think, come back and show what your range condition is and how you're being sustainable across that ecosystem. All in all, if it's the livestock down here on the bottom and the wildlife and the insects, that food, water, vegetation thing, that's all these organisms need out there. They're all working together, and they're all using that same vegetation out there. That's where this whole grazing school brings it all in together for you, that it's the grass that you're managing out there, and not, you can have time to be worried about the livestock, but it's actually the things that are going out on these grasslands and how you actually manage that land in your soil, be it cropland or grass. It's all on how you take care of what's out there and in your management. So with that, I kind of threw you a lot, almost put you to sleep. Anybody have any questions?
What kind of impacts are the electric fences that they're talking about having on wildlife and the movement of wildlife?
Different species of wildlife will react to those electric fences. Actually, most of them will react in a positive way after a while. I've worked with a lot of producers firsthand, that especially even with poly wire, where a deer or something will maybe tear through them a little bit right away, but once they realize what they are, get associated with them, it doesn't seem like they affect them that much. Guys that have big game situations out along the foothills of the mountains and stuff, and maybe have an elk problem, they actually develop these high tensile fences that will just lay down instead of having them go out there and fix all the fence. When these elk come down out of the mountain, they actually just push the fence down. From a regular grassland bird response, you could probably go back and say that some species of exotic birds will actually use a fence more as a perch compared to whatever else. But I think all in all, what you're doing from a grassland management standpoint and changing your stock density out there and changing that season use is more of a benefit for the grassland species overall. So it's very workable, and it's a great tool.
With the comments about the electric fence wire, I'm really hard on electric fence, but if you get the black and white, they can see it better. They don't tear it up your fence.
In my area, where there's a lot of wind turbines that come up, do they affect birds in any way, shape, or form? Because I've had bird watchers on them around watching to see how many birds it kills and blades go around.
It does. And maybe not actually a take is what those turbines are actually doing. Some species can tolerate a lot more, or they can adapt a lot readily than some other species. But let's say, I know they have identified that, let's say prairie grouse, if it's prairie chickens or sharptails, they actually tend to actually just stay away. They'll actually move some of their elects, their sites, away from some of the turbines just because of the noise, more or less. But they, you know, so to speak, some of them actually just shift away from certain areas. But all in all, you know, it's all wildlife. Some cannot adapt. Some of them changes, you know, they're already pushed their limits. And you might, you know, we might see a decline more. Just because it probably comes down to just as much that some of our habitat types that bird requires in other areas where the wind towers are not there available for them. So that's where you see, you know, maybe in your area that a lot of our grasslands that we have that are left are on some of these, you know, some of the lowest fertile soils or maybe rockier stuff, and where we end up, you know, that's last grassland habitat. So then if we put towers there, wind towers, well, they're going to have a negative effect because that's all that's left for them to begin with.
Hey Chuck, one thing to point out is that anybody that's in that sage-grouse initiative area, there's a cost share funding to actually make fencing more wildlife friendly, remove some fencing if it's not being used, and there's a number of wildlife cost share programs as well as other things that are priority in that sage-grouse initiative.